Good evening and welcome to Crossroads Cultural Center. Crossroads is the work of members of the Ecclesial Movement, Communion and Liberation. I'm sorry, can you guys hear me back there? Okay. Who share an interest in the relationship between religion and culture. The center seeks to explore ways in which Christianity gives new impulse to the human desire for knowledge and beauty. Our goal is to offer opportunities for education, to cultivate a passion for looking at reality with openness, curiosity, and critical awareness. The ideal of Crossroads can be summed up in the suggestion of St. Paul: test everything, retain what is good. We are pleased tonight to present to you Beyond the Arab Spring, Reasons for Hope, with our panelists Robert Riley and Wael Farouk. And if you allow me just one moment to introduce our moderator, Mark Danner. Mark currently works as a consulting manager in Homeland Security and Public Safety for National Strategies, which is a business-to-government consulting firm in Washington, D.C. At National Strategies, he uses his expertise in national security affairs to advise clients, foreign and U.S., on U.S. government affairs. Mark's career started with 16 years in the U.S. government, during which time he held a variety of positions, ranging from diplomatic postings in North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean to a number of Washington-based assignments involving Middle East peace process, counterterrorism, and Islamic extremism. For 30 years, he has been a passionate student of Middle Eastern affairs with a particular interest in interfaith dialogue, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim dialogue. So we thank Mark Danner for hosting our panel tonight.
Thank you, Barbara. So a big welcome to all of you and to our guests, Professor Wael Farouk and Robert Riley. I am very, very honored to be here and hosting this, because what really struck me was when I was invited to be the moderator, I couldn't think of two better speakers I wanted to be at a table with. I just spent the last several months reading through Robert Riley's outstanding book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, and I had been thinking about reaching out to meet him. I wanted to, and here's my opportunity tonight. Wael Farouk is a good friend of mine and the executive director of the Cairo Meeting, the cultural festival that was held in Egypt in 2010, and again this year, and an extraordinary man who's taught me a whole lot. So really, what better speakers to have to take us beyond this cacophony of breathless sound bites that we hear from war correspondents speaking in simplistic slogans, the YouTube videos of angry demonstrators across the Arab world and the sounds of crackling gunfire, the bearded politicians now who are coming into power with speaking in simplistic slogans. And all of this is with a popular sense, at least here in the West, of a sense of foreboding, chaos, what's to come. And so into the fray comes Crossroads with this excellent combination of speakers tonight. On the eve of the Egyptian elections, we're a little over 2 weeks away. Syria's sliding into civil war, and we have this initiative to bring Robert Riley and Wael Farouk together to share their wisdom and their experience to help us go deep into the situation in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and to avoid at all costs what one of my favorite political philosophers, Russell Kirk, described as the drug of ideology, to avoid these terrible simplifiers who reduce reality to slogans, and whose great enemy is reason enlightened by faith. And here it's interesting to recall that Pope Benedict XVI's seminal lecture in Regensburg was a critique both of the West's abandonment, secularized West's abandonment of reason, and also a critique of fundamentalist Islam, which has posited, as Robert Riley explains so beautifully in his book, that man can't know reality through reason. Reality is unknowable. And indeed, I want to just pause and read a beautiful quote from Benedict when he traveled to Yaoundé, Cameroon, where he met with the Muslim community there and said, "Religion and reason mutually reinforce each other, since religion is purified and structured by reason. And reason's full potential is unleashed by revelation and faith. I therefore encourage you, my dear Muslim friends, to imbue society with the values that emerge from this perspective and elevate human culture as we work together to build a civilization of love." I don't want to spend too much time on my comments. I want to go quickly to our speakers who have so much to say. So allow me to give an introduction to Wael Farouk and Robert Riley and really take a chance to highlight some of the points in their backgrounds which have most moved me. Wael Farouk is currently a Strauss Fellow at the New York University, where he spent the year researching the language of Islamic culture, literature, philosophy, and religion, and pursuing an analysis of the factors which shaped the Arab mind and constituted the seeds of contemporary Islam's contradictions and problematic issues. He's recently published Hats and Turbans, Adaptation of Modernity and the Conventional Mind. Mr. Farouk was born in Cairo, Egypt. He was an assistant professor for Islamic studies, this is interesting where he was, at the Copto-Catholic Faculty of Theology in Cairo, in Egypt, 2005 to 2008. He's been a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at Macerata University in Italy since 2005, an instructor at the Arabic Language Institute at the American University in Cairo, where I studied Arabic long ago. And he is a columnist in several Arab and Italian newspapers and magazines, and president of the Tawassul Cultural Center for Inter-Civilization Dialogue. As I said earlier, he served as the executive director of the Cairo meeting that was held in 2010 on the eve of the Egyptian uprising. The theme of the meeting was beauty, the space for dialogue. And let me just pause to say that for me, a student of Middle East affairs for 30 years and just a lover of Egyptian politics and culture, there has been nothing like the Cairo meeting that was held in 2010. It was an historic meeting where thousands of people came together, Muslims and Christians, to hear cultural presentations by Muslims, Jews, Christians, about life, about culture, about beauty. And the whole event was organized by volunteers, hundreds of Egyptian volunteers. This year, the Cairo meeting will happen again in October of 2012, and I wait with great anticipation for that, because truly, as one Egyptian journalist who was asked, well, did you know that the revolution was coming? Could you even have any indication? He said, yes, I did. I attended the October 2010 Cairo meeting, and I saw a young people that was alive, that was living their faith in life and culture in a new way, and I knew it was possible for change to come to Egypt. Robert Riley is a senior fellow for strategic communication at the American Foreign Policy Council, a nonprofit organization here in Washington dedicated to bringing information to those who make or influence foreign policy in the United States and assisting world leaders building democracies and market economies. AFPC works closely with members of Congress, the executive branch, and the policymaking community to provide timely and insightful analysis. Mr. Riley has taught at the National Defense University and served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon, where he was a senior advisor for information strategy. In 2003, he was posted to Baghdad, Iraq, where he served as a senior advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Information. Prior to his Pentagon position, he was the director of the Voice of America, the U.S. government's international radio, TV, and internet broadcaster, where he had worked the prior decade. From 1983 to 1985, Mr. Riley served in the White House as a special assistant to the president and served in the United States Information Agency, both here in Washington, D.C. and abroad. In the private sector, he spent more than 7 years with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, both as a national director and then president. And it's ISI that publishes the wonderful Modern Age Journal. I remember as a college student curling up in the library with bound editions, reading through Modern Age. It's a wonderful, wonderful institute. He was on active duty as an armored cavalry officer for 2 years and attended Georgetown University and the Claremont Graduate School. He's published widely on foreign policy, the War of Ideas, and is the author of the book Surprised by Beauty, A Listener's Guide to the Recovery of Modern Music. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Waya.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to Crossroads Cultural Center to give me this opportunity to introduce my testimony and my experience about the Egyptian revolution. I'm not going to speak about Arab Spring. And I'm really happy to be here with my dear friend Mark, and deeply honored to participate in the same event with a great scholar like Robert Reilly. Really, this is not exaggeration. I have.
See can you see the screen as the monitor?
It will be a little bit difficult.
Yeah, you can. If you want a first slide.
So I would start from the visit of President Obama to Cairo almost 2 years before the revolution. It was a very important event in Cairo. Obama have chosen Cairo to deliver his speech to the whole Islamic world. So a lot of jokes was created about this event. One of them speaking about a dialogue, a conversation between President Obama and President Mubarak. So President Mubarak asked President Obama, how much is the average income for an American citizen? President Obama said like $5,000. President Mubarak asked him, how much does life cost, for an average American citizen? President Obama said around $3,000. Mubarak wondered, and what do they do with this difference? And the President Obama said, well, we are a liberal, democratic state. We don't control how our citizens spend their money. In return, President Obama asked President Mubarak, how much is the income of an average Egyptian citizen? He said to him something like 300 Egyptian pounds. President Obama asked back, and how much does life cost in Cairo? Mubarak said around 1,000 Egyptian pounds. President Obama was surprised, asked him, and from where they get this difference? And the President Mubarak said to him, well, we are a liberal, democratic state. We don't ask our citizens from where they get their money. This time, not a joke, it's a true event happened to me. After graduation, I bought my first car. I went to get my license. And for almost a year and a half, I was falling in the test. I couldn't pass this test. And after some time, I was driving all this time in Cairo streets without license. So a friend of mine asked me, but did you pay a bribe to get your license? I said, how can you say this? It's a crime. I can't do this. I said, okay, well, you will never get your license. I tried again and I failed again and again, and finally I had to pay. So it was very heavy for me, really, because I know it's a crime, I know it's wrong, I know I shouldn't do this, I know all of this, and I hate to do this, but finally I have to do it. So because I was very scared, I went to the employee there, and I dropped on the floor something like 50 Egyptian pounds. And I said to him, sir, you have dropped 50 Egyptian pounds on the floor. And he looked at me and looked to the floor and said to me, well, I don't drop less than 100 Egyptian pounds. It is funny now, but back then it was not funny at all. I didn't experience something heavier than living against what you believe you are. It is a heavy experience to do every day something you believe it's evil or bad. In my opinion, this is the main reason and the driving force of this revolution. I mean, I believe the driving force of this revolution was a moral revolution. Okay, excuse me. I think I have loud voice and you will hear me.
Yes.
Okay, yes.
You're fine.
I believe the driving force of this revolution was really moral revolution. Of course, all what experts and scholars say about the crisis, you know, economical crisis, the political depression, dictatorship, I mean, dictatorship, corruption, all of this is true. But also, all of this have existed for 60 years in Egypt. For 60 years in Egypt, Egyptians used to live with all of this political oppression, economical corruption, all of these difficulties in life. Since 2000, it became a familiar for us to read a newspaper about a father who killed his children because for him it's better to die, not to live in hunger. It was like something, we get familiar with this kind of story. So this have existed all the time in my society. My people have lived all the time with this kind of oppression and the crisis. So what happened? What happened in January 2005? How have this revolution started at the first place? This revolution started because of something called social networks. For the first time, the Egyptian people who were divided, I mean, we have like more than 3,000 protestants sit-in and demonstration for, you know, involved like employees, doctors, all on professional basis. Everybody was demonstrating and protesting to get his rights as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a teacher. But social networks have afforded for first time for Egyptian people the possibility to be vocal and to be heard. For first time, you write something and there is hundreds of people who are replying and saying to you, no, this is right, this is good, no, we support you, no, we are against you. And these social networks, there was another life going on. Thank God was away of the eyes of the security. A young blogger who have filmed a police officer distributing some drugs, put this video on the website. The officer get offended. He sent the two informers, grab him and killed him, beat him to death in the street. This is an ordinary event in my country. It's not something extraordinary. It used to happen. But what happened this time, what made difference this time, is the other bloggers started, you know, to say, this is not fair. One of them have created a page called We Are, okay, you just move. We Are All Khalid Said. Khalid Said is the name of this blogger. We Are All Khalid Said in 1 month was joined by 650,000 persons. And there was ongoing conversation, and it's still there, between these young people. What should we do? How should we respond to this evil and this violence? Some people say we can kidnap the officer and kill him, we can burn his house, we can burn the police station. Some people said, no, we cannot practice violence, because if we will be violent, we will not be less evil than them. And finally, this opinion won, and these people decided to go out in huge masses in January 25th, Why January 25th? Because January 25th is the police day. They went out to demonstrate in the police day, handling flowers for police officers, telling them, we love you, we are your brothers, your sons, you are your citizens, you shouldn't be violent with us. And it happened, and for first time we have this huge amount of people walking in the street. The appearance of these people was very interesting because for first time the demonstrators are not professionals. I mean, they were ordinary upper middle class and middle class young people going around the streets, handling flowers to police officers and soldiers who didn't know what to do. They were, you know, full armed in order to control the protest, but they found these people armed by flowers, handling them flowers. They didn't know what to do. A lot of people, thousands of people saw this, were also amazed, say it's no violence, it's a beautiful thing, giving flowers to police and say, please don't do bad things to us. So thousands and thousands of people have joined these marches by these young people. And at the end, people reach a huge number, the police couldn't control them, and they have taken the square. So this story is giving, I mean, I will go quickly because I have very long. There is a lot of things we can see. First of all, most of people who have participated and organized and the call for these demonstrations were not members in political parties, were not Islamists, were not anything. They had no ideology, no ideological background at all. In fact, all political parties in the opposition, all Islamist groups, including Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi, were even against these demonstrations at the beginning. Because we said, exactly, I am calling the Supreme Guide of Muslim Brotherhood, he said, we don't know what and who behind this, because it was not clear. Are they communists? Are they liberalists? Are they Islamists? Nobody couldn't know. And nobody couldn't know because they have no ideology. What did they have? They had a desire of freedom. They had this moral burden, which I personally lived in my everyday life in Cairo. They said, we are not like this, and we will not be like this. No longer. This was the driving force. Also, with this generation, something have changing in physics. For first time and the place are not the containers of human action. Time and the place are the subject of human action. In Egypt, when you go to Egypt, you find a very strange phenomenon. When you enter any Egyptian house, it's extremely clean. But you step outside the house and you find the street extremely dirty. Why? Because people do not own this country. It's not our country. This is my house, but this country is not mine. So, for first time, people own time and the place. For first time, these young people lived in harmony between here and the now. Because in my opinion, as a scholar now, the biggest crisis of contemporary Arab mind is this division between here and the now. The society is divided into two trends. One trend believes that we have to go back to the golden period of the Prophet and his companions. We have to recall this time back because it was the only time of purity and justice. And the other trend say, no, this tradition and this past is in fact an obstacle to any progress, and we have to follow and to copy the Western civilization. And these two trends is introducing basically this division, because the first is living here, but is alienated in now. They are not living now. They wanted to live the golden past. So we find they have this division between here and the now. The other trend also are suffering the same division because they are living now, but they are not living here. minds and hearts are there. So, for first time, this division between time and the place was ended. And for first time, the revolutionaries have given names of each day of the revolution. What does it mean to give a name of each day of your life? It means you give this day an identity. You give this day a meaning. It was the same. It was the same also dying, defending a square. Dying, defending a square. Why? Because this square have represented the space of freedom, the physical space of freedom. So this revolution have represented, the second point, a unity between time and the place for first time for the Egyptian man. In this environment, we all the time talk about women empowerment. As you can see here, women were in first line of the revolution. They were leading, and I have seen with my own eyes a student of American University dressed in a very Western way, preaching a group of bearded men from Salafi groups. I have seen this with my own eyes, and I couldn't believe, because as a scholar, I know for them, the voice of woman is forbidden to hear, to be heard. And I saw them listening to them. Why? Because these women have paid blood, as you can see in these images, for the revolution. For first time, we have 25,000 women marching for their rights. Rising up, a slogan says, "We are not women, we are Egyptians." This is new things, never happened before in my society. This image, and for Mark, I think it might be astonishing, and for any scholar who studied Islam, because we find women are praying next to men in first line of the prayer. This is, it might be even irritating for Muslims, because it's against the creeds. But it was practiced, it was performed in the square. So this square have introduced a sort of utopia, but it's not an imaginary utopia. It was lived utopia. We have lived this. You all know about these clashes between Muslims and the Christians in Egypt. Christians, minority, are definitely, and were oppressed, but not by Egyptian people. They were oppressed by government. And after, if you are interested, I can speak more about this. What I want to say here, if you see in this image, Christian Egyptians are very proud of their religion. For this reason, when they grow up, part of their baptism is to have this tattoo. You can see here, it's a cross here. And you see behind, Muslims are praying. This was the relationship between Muslims and the Christians in the square. Christians were standing next to each other, making a mosque, forming a mosque by their bodies. Sunday, Muslims did the same. In Tahrir Square, Christian bodies were a mosque, and the Muslim bodies were a church. This happened in the square. Here we see, this image also is gives an indication of who did this revolution. This man is not poor. This man is not angry because from the way he is dressing, from his watch, expensive watch, very expensive sunglasses. This is the type of people who have did this revolution. And you see in his fancy sunglasses, what he did. One eye is the cross, the other is little moon. So representing this unity. This what was lived. And he is praying. So he is faithful. So my first claim and the main source of my hope about the future of this revolution is that it's not a revolution of anger, because bad and the dark economical, political conditions. It's a revolution of faith. Only faith led these people to freedom. And only faith make Mubarak fail to oppose them. How can you oppose this desire of freedom? I mean, if you have a political party or a political leader or ideology, you can really distort it, you can arrest people, put them in prison, you can do many things. But what you do in front of desire, this desire of freedom. So Mubarak failed to do anything. In the square, it was another world. Egyptian society, for example, is very famous by the sexual harassment. In the square, there were hundreds of thousands of people, and no one sexual harassment accident took place. Egyptian streets are dirty. The square hosted millions every day, and it was clean. We see here, people were isolated. We have medical care. People get sources of power because mobiles and social network are important. They had their own media station. And here we see cleaning. Whoever go to Cairo, he is really very aware of how strange this image is. But we have lived this. Why people did this? Is it a political ideology? Is anger can make people take out the best of their humanity, demonstrate the best of their humanity? I don't think so. Egyptian people love, as I have started, joking. Some people, when they get married, they get their marriage photo in some natural or monument, but in Egypt, people used to take their photos in front of tanks. And of course, this symbolic thing, they had a memorial. They couldn't get the bodies of people who died defending the square, but they made a memorial using their photos. So this was a revolution which made everybody, surprised by its beauty, peaceful. So after revolution, what happened? As many says, the Arab Spring turned into an Islamic winter. I am not afraid of this also. Why I am not afraid? For the same reasons. These people, what happened in Egypt represent a change, not in a political balance, not in an economical stage. It represents a change in human factor. For first time, Egyptians are vocal and they are standing for their rights. In the day of election, Facebook was not Facebook, was fingerbook. Because everybody have voted and put his finger in this phosphoric ink, put instead of his face, his finger. So it was fingerbook in this day. But it was amazing. How does it come? How does it come? These hundreds of thousands of people were willing to sacrifice their lives supporting liberal slogans, and directly after revolution, they went to vote for Islamists who are not liberals at all. It is amazing. In my opinion, it's not at all. Why? Because this is because of the history of modern state in Egypt. This image representing exactly what I want to say, because you see this pyramid, autocracy, democracy, theocracy. It's only the top of the pyramid represented the society. But the whole society, the whole pyramid, where is it? Is it completely absent? So this is the biggest problem. Egypt can be democracy or theocracy according to the surface. But the society itself, they are suffering this very long history of coexisting contradictions, in which the Islamic discourse is exactly similar to very liberal discourse. Of course, this is something also a huge change. Can you imagine For last 50 years, the highest percentage of participation in any election or referendum in Egypt was 17%. You see here, we had 65% participants. Suddenly, in 2-3 months after revolution. So, the discourse, liberal discourse and the Islamic discourse, in my opinion, are the same. So it was not difficult for people to go and vote for Islamists, because you tell me, what is the difference between a liberal, secular, modernist discourse of the state of Mubarak with a traditional content abusing religion to justify dictatorship? This is what Egyptian people used to live with. After revolution, a traditional discourse with a modernist appearance. Islamists have won this election under the title, the Democratic Coalition. So this coexisting of contradictions is explaining to us what happened after revolution is not a big change. It's exactly a continuity of 60 years of dictatorship before it. So we find the features of this discourse overlapping always, and these rationals, liberals, or Islamists, both of them, they search for its legitimacy in the past. Rational Islam and the liberal Muslims, they go back to Averroes, to the great philosopher representing the rationality in Islam religion. And the traditionals do the same. So instead of getting in touch with reality, instead of living reality, liberals as well as traditionals, they go back to past to look for a legitimacy, to live in present. So present was always a prisoner of past. And the same contradiction between the form and the content. Traditional was the idea of Islamization of modernity. So I can have a cell phone, but because music is forbidden, I have the Quran instead of music. So it's an Islamic cell phone now. But it's the same for modernists. How can a parliament and all liberal institutions of the Egyptian state, its main work is justifying tyranny and dictatorship? So we see this is a contradiction between the form and the content. And sometimes they also have their same starting point. Liberal Muslims or rational Muslims, exactly as a Salafi Muslim, they believe Islamic law is good for all times and all places. But of course, everybody uses this as a starting point to reach a different end. So liberals say yes, it fits every time and every place because it's flexible and it can change. Traditionalists, they believe human nature is never changed, so Islamic law is valid for all times and all places. So I don't want to, Mark, please let me know how much time I. So all of this is features of this of this overlapping discourse, which explains to us why people, epistemologically have voted for Islamists. For example, there is this, the relationship with difference. For liberal and rational Islamists, they exclude difference because Islam is democracy in Islam. And even we have the dean of the faculty of the Foundation of Religion have published a book claiming that Islam has performed and practiced democracy 14 centuries before West. And the West, if there was no Andalus or Sicily or other places would never know anything about this. So Islam is democracy, democracy in Islam. This is what's so-called the rationals. The militant or the Salafist or Orthodox, no. They exclude the different. So they say, no, democracy is against Islam, and whatever is democratic should be destroyed. So we see almost the same strategy of discourse, exclusion, excluding difference or excluding different. So after revolution, putting in mind this was the culture of the majority of people, and putting in mind this revolution, the revolutionaries, they didn't take the power because they were not claiming power, and this is another strength point of this revolution. No one from those who were standing in the square, willing to die for the freedom, wanted to have the power. No one claimed the power. So, who take the power basically is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which we called summary SCAF. People believe that this SCAF is still representing the former regime of Mubarak. So, for the many reasons, many clashes. Yes, please. Okay, you have jumped one.
Oh, let's go back. Back.
No?
Let's see.
Yes.
Well, there's no, there's
Okay. So anyway, so people believe that there is also an agreement between army or SCAF and the Islamists, and it was clear in the results of election and everything. And this is also another positive point and the sources of hope for me, because if the main organized institutional powers, solid powers in society, agree together about something, and at the end, they cannot maintain power in society for almost a year and a half now. This is why. Why they cannot, if they are the solid powers, why they cannot maintain the power up to now? Because there is resistance. And this resistance is not, in my opinion, against. Most of people who go to demonstrate, they demonstrate always not for party or always for principles. For example, after the parliamentary election, liberals were demonstrating to handle power for the elected parliament, which formed by Islamic majority. A lot of reasons make people believe that the Supreme Council of Armed Forces is working in favor of the former regime. Many people believe that they want a reform, they don't want a change. And this is different of points of view between revolutionaries and Supreme and the SCAF. But at the end, those young people, they are still active. They have lived an experience, and they are not willing to give up this experience. After the practice of power for Islamism, only for 3 months, 47% of people who have voted for Islamists, they are not going to vote for them again. Why? Because freedom is the biggest enemy of fundamentalism and extremism. What kept Muslim Brotherhood alive for 8 years in Egypt? Who allowed them to have a mosque in each street? Who gave up the rural areas and the suburbs of Cairo to Islamic fundamentalism? Who did this? Was the Mubarak regime. Why? To say there is an Islamic threat, I have to practice this tyranny and the dictatorship in order to block this Islamic danger. Here in United States and in West, we are fine with this, we don't see. So, for very long time, Islamists were getting stronger every day, in my opinion, basically because of this. Because in 3 months, they have lost a lot of credibility. I don't know if you are familiar with this MP job, nose job. They are lying, they are liars, they are corrupted. The drafting assembly, which worked only for 2 weeks, have consumed food and the hot drinks, tea and the coffee, 3 million Egyptian pounds. In a very poor country like Egypt. So there is a lot of things. I know I'm over. Last thing I want to show you. Yes, this video, please.
Other video, okay, I'll
Yes.
do this.
So, of course, people say there is oppression, and what you will do. When we think about Egyptian revolution, we think of French Revolution, Iranian Revolution. We always do the same like Islamists. We make present prisoner of past. There is an oppression. A lot of people have voted for Islamists. A lot of people, they have distorted facts. So what these activists did, they take the social networks outside the virtual world to reality. And they started a campaign in 16 Egyptian cities, making these campaigns showing what is going on in social networks in the streets, using a projector and a screen like this, and they go to streets to people who have no access to virtual world. And believe me, it was very effective, because people have seen the reality. So yes, there is a development of oppression, but at the same time, there is a development of resistance. And up to now, the initial date of handling the power to a civilian administration was end of 2013. What make it June 2012? These campaigns. The people who have died in the streets in demonstrations. And I have to say, I am against any violence, because this violence against the spirit of the revolution. But these people are not violent, they are not armed. I have met some people, I am working in American University, which is basically on the square. And I have met many young people making a tattoo with their names and phone numbers of their families. And they are students in university. They are not politicians. They are not politicians. They are not communists. They are not Islamists. They make tattoo by their names and phone numbers of their families, because the biggest problem during the revolution was the distorted corpse. And some families couldn't recognize the corpse of their children. So can you imagine somebody is doing something like this? Solidarity between Muslims and the Christians, which was born in the square, is still going on. Now, one of the most powerful movements is We Are All Mina Daniel, who was a Coptic Christian activist killed by thugs. Because now we have these thugs who appear only in political, never attack a bank, never steal money, never attack people walking in the street. Thugs appear only when there is a political demonstration. So, in conclusion, I can say the reasons, all difficulties which face this revolution, in my opinion, it's the main reasons of hope. Because, in my opinion and in my experience, the true change was not a political or economical change. It was change in every individual living in Egypt. I was coming back for vacation in Christmas. And in Egypt, not everybody is rich enough to afford the cable to watch international soccer matches, because it's something very... And it was 10 a.m. in the morning, and I found, this is not what I saw, but something represented. I found a huge amount of people sitting in coffee shop watching. And I asked the taxi driver, what are the people, what kind of matches played 10 a.m. in the morning? And they said to me, no, this is a parliamentary session. This is the true change. And this is the only guarantee for this society and these people to maintain their freedom and to build their future. Thank you very much.
all, I want to say what a pleasure it is to appear here this evening under the auspices of Crossroads. I want to thank Mark for his kind and generous introduction, and for Mr. Farouk for his very stirring remarks. I'm delighted that we're going to be together in Rimini, Italy for a conference in August. I understand that Mr. Farouk has been there several times before, so I'm sure he'll know where the best restaurants are. A bit of geography. Well, whose heart fails to go out to the courageous people in Tahrir Square, or in Tunis, or in Libya, or in Syria today? Who could fail not to empathize with these people and wish for them that finally they were throwing off the yoke of tyranny and despotism under which they have suffered for so long? Who could not wish that for them? I certainly do, and that is what my heart tells me. And it was with my heart, I confess, that I went to Iraq in 2003 on Operation Iraqi Freedom with Iraqi expats in this country and working with, obviously, Iraqis there, both Sunni, Shia, Arab and Kurdish, hoping that something could come out of the misery, suffering, and tyranny that they had endured in the form of a rule of law, constitutional, democratic government. By the way, one of my colleagues in the back here, Andrew Baird, we were together at that time. And I'm a little embarrassed that I still have in my resume that I was the senior advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Information during that period, because by the time we got to Baghdad, the ministry had ceased to exist, so my duties were rather light, I suspect. However, as much as our hearts may lead us in sympathy in that direction, what does one's head tell one about what is taking place? And I am going to begin here by quoting some of the people in the region about what they think is taking place, and alluding to a couple of recent events. In Mr. Farouk's own country, he knows just last week or the week before, one of the most famous Egyptian actors was fined in court for insulting Islam because of some role he had played in a movie. Just last week, the owner of a television station in Tunisia was convicted, quote, of disturbing public order and threatening public morals, unquote. For what? For broadcasting the film made by an Iranian expat in French called Persepolis, which is done as a cartoon fashion presentation in French about what has happened in Iran. Has anyone seen Persepolis? Some of you have. I have. Could you possibly conceive that broadcasting that movie would be threatening public order or disturbing it or threatening public morals? It's a little hard to conceive of, particularly in light of the fact that the movie had been cleared for broadcast or for showing in Tunisia before, and indeed had shown in a movie theater in Tunis for several months without incident. Yet now, post-Arab Spring, it's a problem. One of Mr. Farouk's countrymen, Naguib Sawiris, famous Coptic, very wealthy businessman, one of the co-founders of Free Egyptians Party, said, "They have substituted the dictatorship of the Mubarak with the dictatorship of the Muslim Brotherhood." That's where Egypt is going now. A message from Libya. Sorry, this is also from Tunisia. This means the revolution of the Arab Spring has been stolen by the Islamists. I feel it is necessary for secular intellectuals to agitate and expose the Tunisian Nada Party, their version of the Muslim Brotherhood, headed by Ghannouchi, for this is the thin end of the wedge. It is a disaster and it must be condemned. Secular intellectuals must not keep silent and must expose the head of the Nada, who declared to the Western media before the elections that he would not oppose even the wear of bikinis and drinking of alcohol, etc. But after their victory, they have begun to reveal their ugly truth. This is the way they deceive their voters and the world, unquote. Now from Libya, Hussein Ibish, quote, there is an intellectually and politically indefensible rush to recast the leading Arab Islamist parties as more moderate or pluralistic than they actually are. It's simply foolish not to recognize that they remain in every meaningful sense radical and retain their totalitarian impulses, that they would like to broadly and severely restrict the rights of individuals, women, minorities in the name of religion is obvious. 2 weeks ago on Egyptian television, a Sudanese writer by the name of Al-Hajj Waraq said the following. It's a long quote, but it's worth listening to. It is very important for the people in Egypt to understand that democracy is about more than just the ballot box. Democracy is a culture engraved upon the cerebral box before it is the ballot box. One cannot talk about freedom in the absence of free minds. The tragedy of the Arab Spring is that when the tyrannical regimes fell, the fruits were reaped by movements that preach closed-mindedness rather than free thinking. The outcome will be regimes that are worse than those that were toppled. When you purport to be speaking in the name of Allah, any opposition becomes opposition to Allah. This is where the danger lies. A religious state necessarily leads, in all cases, to the criminalization of dissenting views, which becomes heresy. Since these movements have a totalitarian view on all aspects of life, they want to dictate how you should conduct politics. What are you to consume? What clothes should you wear? And what theater you should watch? They want to control the human world in its entirety. And therefore, they necessarily lead to the violation of human personal liberties. In its entirety. As inspired as we were by the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, there was another gathering there of several million people. I wonder how many of you may have seen it or been aware of the gathering to greet the return to Egypt of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the de facto spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. Do you know about this? No. Only a few of you do. He was given a military escort to the podium. Wael Dunham, the Twitter hero of Tahrir Square, was prevented from coming to the podium. And Yusuf Qaradawi was welcomed and gave his speech. Let's listen to a few of the things he has to say, since he is the most popular preacher in the Muslim, certainly in the Muslim Arabic world today. This segues rather nicely with what the Sudanese intellectual just told us. Islam is a comprehensive school of thought, a creed and ideology, and cannot be completely satisfied but by completely controlling society and directing all aspects of life, from how to enter the toilet to the construction of the state. Welcome home, Mr. Qaradawi. In his book, Islam and Secularism Face to Face, Qaradawi wrote, "Secularism is atheism." He also said, in respect to the separation of church and state that is typical of Christianity, that contrasts, I'm quoting from him, that contrasts with what would happen if the Islamic State did this. The result would be that the faith would be left without any authority to support it or forced to maintain it, unquote. Earlier this year, Qaradawi assured an audience in a television interview that the Sharia should be gradually implemented in Egypt after the revolution, and there should be no chopping off of hands in the first 5 years. Now, the organization of which he is the de facto spiritual director was led, first of all, in its political manifestation in the Freedom and Justice Party by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who was disqualified, and that was Mr. al-Shatter. And so he has been replaced by Mr. Morsi. But let's listen to what Mr. Shatter said. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood has existed for 84 years, founded by Hassan al-Banna in reaction to the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. And it was al-Banna's intention to create a Sharia-based state as a step toward the resuscitation of the Caliphate. His model, the one-party state of the Soviet Union, the Italian brown shirts, he thought one-party Western totalitarian rule was a fine model for what he hoped to achieve for the Muslim Brotherhood. For 84 years, the Muslim Brotherhood has stayed true to its principles through the development of a highly disciplined cadre, which cadre is still in place today. And do you suppose that after that disciplined dedication of this period of time that they're going to give up the principles on which they are founded? Not according to al-Shatter. As he opined recently, quote, no one can come and say, let's change the overall mission. No one can say, forget about discipline, obedience, and structures. No. All of these are constants that represent the fundamental framework of our method, the method of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is not open for developing or change. The revolution needs to become perpetual with a core group of 1 or 2 million. Mohamed Morsi, who has replaced him as the candidate, since al-Shatter was disqualified, said in a rally 2 weeks ago, this is the old Islam is the solution platform. The Quran is our constitution and Sharia is our God. These are familiar slogans from the Ikhwan. Now, one Islamist who wrote the biography of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the leader of the Brotherhood Party in Tunisia and Nada, al-Tamimi, made I thought, a brilliant observation about the political climate in the Arab Spring. He said, the real struggle of the future will be about who is capable of fulfilling the desires of a devout public. It's going to be about who is Islamist and who is more Islamist, rather than about the secularists and the Islamists. That's the struggle. Who's Islamist and who is more Islamist? And let us remember, after the Arab Spring, the first referendum in Egypt was over the question as to whether or not to hold early parliamentary elections. The liberals and secularists in Egypt said, no, we can't have early elections because we haven't had time to organize political parties. This is the first time we've been free. So if we have early elections, this will simply be a huge benefit to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most highly organized element in our society outside of the state. What was the result of that referendum? 77% voted for the early elections. Many of them animated by rumors circulated through mosques and other publications saying, vote for early elections, otherwise a Copt or a woman could be president of Egypt. We certainly wouldn't want that to happen. And lo and behold, later when the parliamentary elections are held, what do we see again? Some 70% of the vote goes to the Salafis and to the Ikhwan. Even if, as some scholars like Daniel Pipe say, that the military council, the SCAF, manipulated the results, that's considering the participation level of those elections and some of the observations, any way you look at it, this is a confirmation of some of the worst fears in this respect. these are statements that Mr. Farouk would be very familiar with, coming from some of the Salafists, the Noor Party spokesman, Youseri Hamad, who considers God's law as the only law. He will make an interesting legislator, let me assure you. Quote, "In the land of Islam, I can't let people decide what is permissible or what is prohibited. It is God who gives the answers to what is right and what is wrong, period. One God, one vote, one time." That is the Islamist theory of democracy. Another Salafi spokesman, Sheikh Shahat, "I want to say citizenship restricted by Islamic Sharia, freedom restricted by Islamic Sharia, equality restricted by Islamic Sharia. Sharia is obligatory, not just the principles, the rule of God, not the rule of people." And as you probably know, in Libya, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, the chairman of the Transitional Council, said each law that contradicts Sharia law is void. Well, this has led a friend of mine from the Middle East, who is a Muslim intellectual reformer, philosopher, and physicist, sent me this message by email. It's extremely distressing. He said, "As I see, this new Islamic wave is necessary. It is similar to the necessity of Nazi Party control of Germany. The Nazis caused many historical disasters, but these disasters were quite strong and hard lessons for Germans and the world. Middle Eastern societies are in need of learning such a hard lesson from these retarded parties." Unquote. Of course, he's being sarcastic, but it gives you some level, some understanding of the level of distress concerning the hope for the kind of change that Mr. Farouk espouses. Now, just briefly, let me say one reason why my head tells me that what my heart wishes for is not going to happen is because the way in which most Arab societies are organized. That is, what institutions operate within them that could possibly rule. And these devolve to basically three. One is the military. The military cum royal ruler or quasi-royal ruler, you know, the Assad family or the Mubarak family, until he oversteps and tries to anoint his son, and then the military removes him. So you have the royal, quasi-royal military connection along with the mukhabarat and the police. That's one center of institutional power in Arab societies. The second one is the Islamist, the political Islam centers, represented by the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates. The third is tribal, which in certain places like Libya, Yemen, Somalia is much stronger than in others, such as Egypt. But it would appear that only one of these three, or some combination of those three, would be in any position to benefit from the situation that has been created by the Arab Spring, and not the courageous people who have taken upon themselves all the risks that they have in the way in which Mr. Farouk just so eloquently described to you. They have no organization, they have no discipline, they have no funding. And even were one to suppose that they were the majority, it wouldn't make any difference. Any more than it did in revolutionary Russia, where a tiny Bolshevik party took over, any more than it did in the Weimar Republic, in which a minority Nazi party took over, or in any way that it mattered in Iran, which did not have a majority in the revolution against the Shah until the other elements of the coalition were taken out by al-Khamenei. The discipline, the organization, the ruthlessness, the financing, those organizations are the ones that can benefit from this, and not the well-intentioned people who have suffered to make this possible. Tariq Hegi is another famous Egyptian businessman and intellectual. He said, what happened in Tunisia and Egypt and what is happening in many Arab countries cannot be properly understood except through the intellectual history of the Arabic-speaking societies over the last 14 centuries. And that's what I'm going to cover in the next 2 minutes. But something does need to be said about this. Mark referred to the Regensburg lecture, which in the shorter portion of it did address the crisis in the Islamic world, though most of it was about the crisis in the Western world. I'm going to try to distill this for you with just a couple of quotes. Mark was kind enough to mention my book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, which focuses on what I take to be one of the greatest intellectual dramas in human history, which took place in the 9th century in Baghdad. And it was precisely over who God is and what the status of man's reason is in relation to God, along with revelation. On one side was the first theological school that arose in Islam, said God is rationality and justice. And man, through his reason, should come to know God through his creation, through his revelation. But through his reason, he can come to know what is good and wrong. And he has been given freedom because he's obligated to choose what is right and what is just. And God wouldn't be just if he put that obligation upon man without giving him the ability to know what is right and wrong. And that's not just for Muslims, that's for everybody. Everybody has this obligation and everybody has these capabilities of their reason. Therefore, one of the great theologians of this Mutazilite school said, quote, "It is obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason." Morally obligatory. To do what is in accord with reason, what is reasonable. The opposing second theological school that arose was called the Ash'arites after al-Ash'ari, and they denied absolutely everything that I just put out. Reason is incapable of knowing what is right or wrong or what is just and unjust. You can only know that through revelation. God is not obligated to reward the good and punish the evil. He may wish to punish the good and reward the evil, and you can't gainsay him. Nothing is good or evil in itself, but that God says it so. In other words, you could ask yourself, does God forbid murder because it's wrong, or is it wrong because he forbids it? The Mutazilites said, God forbids it because it's wrong. The Ash'arites said, no, it's wrong because he forbids it, and he could change his mind and obligate you to engage in ritual murder, and there would be no gainsaying him. God is a legal positivist. Right is the rule of the stronger, and God is the strongest. Therefore, contrary to Abdul al-Jabbar, who said it is obligatory to carry out what accords with reason, Al-Ghazali, the greatest of these Ash'arites, and his teacher said, Al-Juwayni said, there is nothing obligatory by reason. Al-Ghazali said, no obligations flow from reason, but from the Sharia. In other words, your reason can tell you nothing about the goodness or evil or the justness or injustice of anything you are considering doing. There is no such thing as Aristotle's The Ethics. There is no such thing as moral philosophy. Your salvation depends solely upon what you know of God's revelation in Islamic scripture and in Sharia. And that is what you are totally dependent upon. So your reason has no status. Your reason cannot come to know reality. That is only through revelation. Now, there is another problem. I recently was asked to write the preface to a book that has been translated from German and is coming out in English by a Swiss scholar called Lucas Wick, called Islam and Constitutionalism. This is an extremely interesting book because this Swiss scholar examines what constitutions have existed in the Muslim world, and more importantly, he examines the theological presuppositions for effective constitutional government to see if they are present in a broad range of Islam. In other words, he doesn't just look at the Salafists, he doesn't look at just the Ikhwan, he looks across the entire spectrum of thought in the Middle East today at the theological level to see if any of them support genuine constitutionalism. Here is one of the underlying problems. In Sunni Islam, as it is understood by the majority of people there, sovereignty belongs exclusively to God. Man is not sovereign. God is sovereign. In the West, Jewish or Christian or not, everyone is so familiar with Genesis that to even mention it is kind of a bore. But since the revelation in Genesis that man is made in the image and likeness of God is the foundation of our civilization, we need to pay attention. If we are made in the image and likeness of God, what is that image in us that is divine? Certainly an immortal soul, that's no problem for Islam, they believe in immortal souls. Reason and free will, that these are godlike, these are divine. And it is why both freedom and reason, that is freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, have arisen within the West because they are inviolable as God-given and as reflections of a divine image in us. And therefore, they're not granted to us, they are part of us in the way in which we were made. That is why popular sovereignty was possible. Because of that revelation and because of the theology that emanated from it. One of the problems in Sunni Islam, as it understands itself, is that man is not sovereign because he is not made in the image and likeness of God. If you look at the Quran and its creation accounts, it's decisively not so that man is made. He is not made in the image and likeness of God. And to suggest that he is a form of blasphemy. It's shirk. It's associating something with God. God is so infinitely transcendent to us, there is nothing like him. Ila kaifa. Do not ask why and do not compare anything to him. Certainly not you or me. Certainly not man. So man is not sovereign. This presents an enormous problem in terms of the theological underpinnings for the development of constitutional rule. Now let me also, of course, there's nothing within Islam. There's nothing such as natural law either. And again, in majority Sunni Islam, natural law does not exist. The laws of nature and of nature's God do not exist. And to suggest they do is again another form of shirk, that you are assigning to something, a power independent to that of God, who directly does everything. God is the primary and immediate cause of everything. There are no secondary causes. There is no natural law. Without a theory of natural law, it is impossible to arrive at a solid constitutional theory. So this interesting book examines this question as to whether or not this can develop, and of course it doesn't give a very cheery outlook on that. Let me close with this very fascinating statement by the Iranian philosopher Abdul Karim Soroush, who, when you hear what he has to say, you will know he's living in exile. You need some philosophical underpinning, even theological underpinning, in order to have a real democratic system. Your God cannot be a despotic God anymore. A despotic God would not be compatible with a democratic rule, with the idea of rights. So you even have to change your idea of God. Unquote. Well, as the triumph of the Salafists and Islamists in the Arab Spring elections have shown, that change is nowhere on the horizon. There are many, many Muslim intellectuals, reformers, and people who know this and who are trying to effect a change at that level. Many of them are here, or they're in Europe. Few of them are in their own countries because it's too dangerous for them to say what they are there. And it's not getting any safer for them as a result of the changes we have recently seen. I'm going to close here with a quote from one of Mr. Farouk's countrymen again, one of the brilliant Egyptian intellectuals today, Hassan Hanafi, who's chairman of the philosophy department at the University of Cairo. I think this is a very good analysis. He writes that no real change can take place if there is not change in the mindset first. This is the reason, he says, that prior efforts have failed, because they started with social, political, economic structures rather than with inherited intellectual substructures, which remained unchanged even as liberal Western Enlightenment-derived structure were superimposed over them. Why, after all, with the institution of constitutional monarchies in Egypt by the British and in Iraq, I mean, there are old people still remember what life was like under those regimes where there was independent judiciary, real parliaments, relative freedom of press. Why didn't that lead to something more rather than to its repression? Because it was superimposed over them. This has not worked because the imported freedom, therefore, perches on an infrastructure of inherited fatalism, while the imported rights of man sit atop a substructure of the inherited rights of God. In the same way that the imported sciences are superimposed over an infrastructural legacy of miracles, unquote. As this brilliantly insightful sentence implies, the real problem is theological, and it is that level that the reform ultimately has to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Wael. As the moderator, I get the right to ask an opening question, and then certainly we'll have some time for some questions from the audience. I guess my question, turning to you, Robert, and then a question for Wael, is you've painted the totalitarian temptation, take a term from Ravel's book, that is stalking the Arab Spring. And albeit I do see that threat, but it forces me to ask a very concrete question, a very practical question, especially for those in the audience who we're Westerners, we live here. How then shall we live? How shall we engage this phenomenon, these people, these Islamists, these future totalitarians, and on what basis? Should we attempt a dialogue? In your book, there's a quote that dialogue is not possible. Should we craft a creative fight? Is it a public communications fight? Is it a diplomatic fight? How shall we live under the gathering storm clouds?
Cautiously. Here's the source of my discouragement is this. For the prospect of democracy in Egypt, let us ask ourselves this question. How many Egyptians accept the fundamental principle of democracy that all people are created equal? That would include women, that would include Copts, Christians. How many Egyptians believe Muslims and Jews are created equal? That obviously is a rhetorical question, I'm afraid. There was a Pew research in Egypt that 84% of the population supports death for apostasy. What does democracy mean without freedom of conscience? In other words, where is the underlying cultural support for this development? It's not there. It's certainly not there in the majority. It doesn't appear to be there in the majority of people. It's certainly there in some extraordinary individuals. Part of what I do is work with Muslim intellectual reformers. It's there with them. It's obviously there with Mr. Farouk. And what ought we to do? My question is, why haven't we been supporting these people? Why hasn't the United States, over the past several administrations, helped the people whose victory in the Muslim world is in our own interest? Bipartisan failure, I assure you. A grotesque failure. So now we're sitting here thinking of how we're going to accommodate ourselves to these Islamists, as the current administration seems perfectly happy to do. Well, I think I'm afraid things are going to get worse before they're better. And I think we should be supporting our friends, and we ought to be supporting our principles. But I'd love to hear Mr. Farouk answer.
And very simple question for you, Wael. Could you comment?
Do you have time? No, I will start by the last sentence of Mr. Riley, because I believe the best thing would West and the Westerns do ever for Arabs was to be true to the principles of their religion and their civilization.
Here, here.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. Americans went to Iraq and they closed their eyes about Saudi Arabia. The biggest, the strongest advocate of all evil, Mr. Riley, have wonderfully shaped in his speech. My wife is a Croatian diplomat, and she had received a Catholic Croatian, wearing veil, burqa. And she was, what are you doing? Why is this? She said, yes, because we are paid by some Saudi Arabia sheikh. He pay us salary, monthly salary, as long as we keep wearing this burqa. Where is United States of this? United States, as in my country, as I witnessed myself, always waiting for a possible winner to make a good deal with them. Regardless who is this winner, what is his background, is he close or not? And this is the biggest harm West have done. I agree with Mr. Riley about 99% of what he said, but this 1% is very deep difference. The starting point and the end. The starting point in me, it's not only, of course, Islam within itself, and I have published and wrote a lot of things about this, has deep crisis. But in my opinion, if people claim that there is a separation between faith and reason, it doesn't mean in reality there is a separation between faith and reason. This is an ideology. I am against Muslim Brotherhood, but I am not against the members of Muslim Brotherhood. I am against the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood. Turning religion into an ideology is evil. But in my personal experience, in this cultural event meeting Cairo, okay, in this cultural event meeting Cairo, we needed a translator. We were poor. We did everything without money. We had organized a $5 million event with zero budget because of volunteers. This is my experience in my country. We were looking for somebody to translate from Arabic into Italian. We ended to make the story short, with one of the second line of leaders of Muslim Brotherhood, his name Professor Abdel Fattah Hassan, a professor of Italian literature at Ain Shams University. He was struck by hundreds of volunteers working for free to demonstrate their faith. And they said, I am not less than them, I am not going to take my fees for translation. He came, he met people from a movement called the Communion and Liberation, a Catholic movement. He was struck by these people. And he said to me in private, I have joined the Muslim Brotherhood because I wanted to live my faith this way. Because the Western image of faith is something private. It's, you can worship in this closed room, but you cannot be a believer in your everyday life. This is the secularism which offered to us. So this man, after the meeting in Cairo, he read the book Religious Sense by Don Luigi Giussani, and he was struck again and said, this is amazing. Does this man, has another book? I said, yes, but in Italian. He said, okay, I'm a professor of Italian. I gave him Rescue of Education, another book by Luigi Giussani. He read this book and said, no, this book, we need this book. This is what we need. We need education. We have to translate this book. I said to him, okay, he's a leader in Muslim Brotherhood. I said to him, well, okay, find somebody to translate. And he said, why you find somebody? I will translate. I was shocked. You know why? Because interpret in a conference or in a private conversation saying something and publishing a book with your name, something remain with you forever. This Muslim Brotherhood leader have published, translated and published Risk of Education, written by a Catholic priest, demonstrating the Catholic faith. And you know what did he write in his introduction? He wrote, as a Muslim, I am obliged to testify truth wherever I meet it. And this is in the book. And he is a leader of Muslim Brotherhood. And he was ready to meet the consequences of this. This is first story. Second story. While we were organizing for Meeting Cairo, in cooperation with Meeting Rimini, where we are going to, where I am going to have a pleasure of talking again with Mr. Riley, they sent us a film about this Catholic cultural event, Meeting Rimini. At the end of this film, we had this beautiful sentence, beautiful paragraph by Cardinal Ratzinger, who is now the Holy Father, Benedictus XVI, ended with a sentence says, and Jesus Christ is the ultimate form of beauty and truth. As organizers, and I am organizing this meeting together with another 4 Egyptian judges, we watched the movie, and they were said, no, we cannot do this. I said, why? What? We cannot show this film. Why? This sentence, if only one stupid fundamentalist stand up and say this is heresy, we will destroy the work we have done for months. We worked hard to create space for Christians and Muslims to meet and live together. And now with one sentence in this movie, we will destroy everything. We have to cut it off. For me it was hard because I am the one who has very long friendship with the people of Meeting Rimini. I said to them, I cannot do this. I cannot say to my friends, I am ashamed of your faith. And I cannot allow it to be pronounced in a public space in Egypt. They said, okay, we will show the movie, but without the subtitle. usually people who know foreign languages, they are more open-minded. But I said, no, this is not going to work. At the end, I agreed with them to bear all consequences. And I'm not very brave. My wife is a diplomat, and then somehow I'm protected. So I said, okay, don't worry, I will take it. So I was not making a hero. But I was also scared because we have worked a lot, and it's not about my work. It's a work, you know, of 200 young kids, males and females, Muslims and Christians. And Mr. Riley will be amazed if you know the opening ceremony of Meet in Cairo was attended by 1,500 ordinary Egyptian persons. Because we didn't send invitations, these young kids went from door to door in Cairo, knocking the doors of people and said to them, come to see what we are doing. Who are you? We are. So people were curious and they came for this reason. So the film was like 7 minutes, but it was for me like 70 years. I was very stressed because all the time I was waiting for the stupid person who is going to say this is hers. But at the end, when the light was on, the 1500s were applauding. So we have prejudice. And this prejudice sometimes makes us blind. Is there a crisis of reason in Islam? Yes, there is a crisis of reason. Do we have a lot of work to do? Definitely we do. But sometimes our prejudice is the main obstacle to make the reform. Sometimes the biggest problem is not the crisis of reason, but the separation between reason and reality. And here I will say last thing. A Muslim woman is the woman who is covered by burqa, who is deprived from her rights of education, who suffers the female genital mutilation, who deprived to drive a car, who, you can make a long list. All of this is true. All of this is definitely true. Is there one single woman on the earth suffer all of these things together? No. I definitely assure for you. We are suffering from women driving in Cairo streets. So there is something called reality. And with my deep respect to everything Mr. Riley said, I think this contradiction between his noble heart and his head took place before the revolution, and his head said to him, such a revolution can't take place. And this is my point. We have to advocate hope, because hope is what is going to give us strength to fight our battle. If we give up hope, Islamists are going to win forever. The conflict in Cairo now, if any of you, Egypt Constitution in Google, you will read one of the most beautiful constitutions on the earth. Guarantee all personal, individual, and group rights. But it was out of service.
Right.
It was out of service. It was not working. So the problem is not, in my opinion, only the theory. Everything he has said is completely correct. And I completely do agree, and I am amazed by his amount of knowledge about everything. He is even knowing some accidents. I just learned it from him now. But at the same time, I am talking not about the theory, I am talking about what I lived and what I believe. I believe the human nature is good, and this human nature ultimately is going to win. Maybe it's naive, but we will try.
I'd like to tell a story too, if I can. It's a short one. First, it's one of the most brilliant Muslim intellectual reformers I know. Lives in Germany, 10 years, 24/7 German police protection, armored Mercedes, because of the death threats against him by the Islamists. So the courage of people like Mr. Farouk is considerable, let me tell you. This man, whom I admire deeply and from whom I have learned a tremendous amount, deeply, deeply learned. And I said, I'm going to give you anything you need for 20 years, as much money, personnel, printing presses, stations. Tell me how you're going to turn around the Muslim Arab world. And he stopped for a moment and thought, and then he said, I said, what would you do? He said, I'd re-Hellenize it. Which, of course, is exactly the prescription in the Regensburg lecture, not only for the world of Islam, but for us to re-Hellenize ourselves, to restore the integrity of reason, because without that integrity of reason, we don't have any foundation on which to have a dialogue. All right, here's my story. My wife, who's Spanish, went to Cairo, and she's now an American citizen, with a group called the International Institute of Womanhood. And they went to the Cairo population, the UN Population Conference in Cairo, to fight the UN pro-abortion contraceptive forced program. And they would be up early in the morning in their hotel in Cairo, Xeroxing, collating, stapling, and the women's staff at the hotel would line up to help them. Several days of this hard work, my wife Blanca turned to them and said, how can we thank you for everything that you've done to help us? And the Egyptian women said, no, no, it is we who should be thanking you for coming here to help us save our country. That's my story. That's my wife's story.
We have time for a couple questions? Good. You, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Suhail. I agree completely with what you said and your pessimism about the future of these revolutions, because it's basically, as you said, in the mind to start with. My question is, Doctor, to Mr. Farouk. The 25 January revolution was a great thing. I have relatives and friends who went to Egypt just to share in it. But I think it was completely turned upside down by an election that showed that 1 out of 4 Egyptians is a Salafist, and nearly half the Egyptians are Muslim brothers. So my feeling is that this revolution is probably 20%, or 15 to 20% of people. And I thought, well, that's a good thing. That's the start. Once people get educated, they'll increase in number. But they told me that the education system is infiltrated by Muslim brothers and Salafist education. So they're taught in primary school, secondary school, these ideas. And that made me very pessimistic. I don't know how can you feel optimistic when 70% of the people vote fundamental Islamic, either Islamic. And I don't buy this enlightened Ikhwan Muslimin. Because their history doesn't show that at all. Most of the political assassination in Egypt happened by the Muslim brothers, from Ahmed Mahdi Pasha.
Yes.
About 10 or so, all by the Muslim brothers. I mean, you can't tell me we changed or became that.
Okay, as I said, I am against ideology, but I am not against persons. So I believe whoever is a member in Muslim Brotherhood can change. I believe in human change because I have witnessed this myself. Yes, I agree with you. We are in deep crisis, but this deep crisis is not because of the revolution.
No.
This deep crisis because of the dictatorship, who was exactly enforcing Islamists by raising the fear of them. For first time after revolution, Islamists are under lights. And then also about, let's use reason. I am very realistic, I am not optimistic. I am very realistic. In 84 years, they got in the election 40%. in 4 months, revolutionaries got 12%. Is this a loss? I don't see it as a loss. Personally, I don't see it as a loss. Let's look to the institutions of Islamists. Muslim Brotherhood have been divided 5 times in 1 year after revolution. We have seen the Egyptian current, which is the youth of Muslim Brotherhood, were fired out from the community because they call for transparency. Transparency. So, Islamists as institutions are under, ongoing development within the institution itself. This is number one. Number two, their discourse. I am as a liberal, and I cannot say also there is liberal Egyptians, to be honest with you. There are progressive Egyptians. Because liberalism is a culture which is not represented in society, as he was explaining. We wanted to remove the second article of Egyptian constitution, which says Islamic religion is the religion of the state, and Islamic law is the main source of legislation. We were full of hope after revolution to remove this article from our constitution, but we failed. But Islamists failed to add Islamic jurisprudence is the main source, not Islamic law principles. So there is ongoing conflict between new driving force in society, which was able to make a huge change in this society. Of course, there is some actors are sent to court, there is some limitation of free speech, but at the same time we saw what these young people are doing in the street of Cairo. You might broadcast something in TV, but you can go to any popular area and show and say whatever you want. I lived in Egypt and I was involved in public activities for more than 15 years, since I was a student in university. And I have never seen Egyptian people vocal like this. Some people were afraid just to say the name of the president. Now, the candidates for presidency are going around Egypt begging people to vote for them. For God's sake, this is a big change. And this is what gives me hope. I am not saying the condition is pinky and everything is wonderful. No, we are in a deep shit. I'm sorry for using this expression, but this is a reality. But in front of this reality, what are our options? If we say we are not going to make it, we will never make it because we have defeated ourselves. So, yes, there is a lot of problems, but there is a lot of innovations, a lot of new things, which I believe going to change, to make the bigger change. We believe this revolution didn't make any change. We believe this revolution have started the process of change. This is what we believe and this is what we are working for. And I am sorry if I am very excited because after...
We have limited time since we have to be out of here at 9:30, but I think we have time for one more question. Let me get you.
First, I'd like to thank you for dispelling that myth of homogeneity in the Islamist, under the Islamist label, and that myth of unanimity under that label. There clearly is not unanimity when it comes to Islamism and Sharia and all of these things. I'd like to bring up a comparison that can be made historically. There's some individuals who might say that Islam is no more opposed to democracy than any religion at a certain point in its development. That is to say that there was not separation of church and state in medieval Europe. And until relatively recently, it was largely considered that Catholicism was incompatible with rule of law and democracy, and yet we're all here in a dialogue by a Catholic institution. Do you believe that there are theological foundations for democracy in Islam?
Okay. In 1932, an MP stand up and said, in the name of Allah, and this is one of the most diffused sentences in Muslim world. Nahas Pasha, the Prime Minister by that time, said to him, stop, we are not here to speak in the name of Allah, we are here to speak in the name of people. And he shut him up. In our parliament now, everybody was making the parliamentary oath saying, as long as it does not contradict the law of God. So the huge difference between the period and the now is not in Islam. It's in the role which was played by liberals at that time. Liberals at that time were working for society, were building Egypt. And they gained their credibility because of what they do, not because of what they believe. And the now liberals, or what so-called liberals, they have lost, basically because they spent 30 years justifying the dictatorship of Mubarak. So, in Islamic theology, I believe, and here I speak as a scholar, the theology was always representing the society, the structure of society. And unlike many people, I see in the rational history of Islam the crisis of Islamic theology. Because the rational history of Islam, even with Averroes, he have started this compromise with power. And he has to started this very dangerous division. Because he said philosophy and the Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law are the same, are sisters. But the subject of philosophy, of reason, is metaphysics. The subject of Islamic law is everyday life of people. This is very dangerous. Because we want reason to get back his rights, to justify our everyday life, and to guide our everyday life. And on theological basis, there is many scholars are working on this. Not with or against, not for reason or for. Now we are having this problem. How can we find a solution for it? We have a law, you know, Muslim women recently were divorced by SMS. Because the man has the right to divorce the woman whenever he wants. In Egypt, we had the law of Al-Khola, which gave the women the right to divorce themselves. It's a very progressive law, but it was not practiced in Egypt. Why? Because most of women are extremely poor, and they cannot give up their rights. They cannot go out of the house of the husband and survive. So, theology alone is not the obstacle. Theology always can be modified and represent the progress in society.
I would have to take that 1% disagreement. My opinion is that what the Middle East suffers from mostly is a deformed theology that has produced a dysfunctional culture. And that deformed theology was developed under al-Ash'ari, and it became the majority theological school in Sunni Islam. It's not the only one, but it's the majority one. And it formed the culture. So to answer your question of any religion, you have to ask the question, what is the status of reason within it? And here is the key question. In that theology, is God Logos, or isn't he? Is God himself reason? The answer in part of Islam very clearly in the first half of the 9th century was yes, he was. In fact, it was a state doctrine. Free will was a state doctrine. That the Quran was created was a state doctrine, etc. When an Egyptian, one of the outstanding Egyptian intellectuals, Nasser Abu Zayed, tried to say these things about 10, 15 years ago in Egypt, he was declared an apostate.
By Mubarak.
Well, it was under Mubarak, it was by a court, it wasn't by, but you're right. But do you think today he wouldn't be declared an apostate. It would more likely he would be for saying that we need to consider that perhaps the Quran was created, that the Arabic is a human artifact instead of being the eternal language of Allah, and so forth. You know, there is a principle in Islamic jurisprudence, in Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, that says reason is not a legislator. Reason is not a legislator. In other words, once again, we get back to the your reason cannot tell you what is right or wrong. That's solely Sharia, Hadith, Quran. Well, if reason is not a legislator, why have legislatures? That's it. So until this problem, I'm glad to hear Mr. Farouk say they have theologians working on it, because the solution to this has to come at a theological level, particularly in a deeply religious society.
I think we have an agreement with the National Press Club to close up. Let me just close with first of all thanking Robert and thanking Wayne. I would invite you later this summer, in August, to tune in on the web to Robert and Wael's talks that will be broadcast at Rimini. I watched you last year and watched your Muslim Brotherhood friend introduce the risk of education, which was a shock to me to imagine such an event could happen. A beautiful, beautiful shock. It'll be great to see you there too. So you can follow them. If you leave your name and address in the back, okay, but I would just add that for those who are interested, I've put together a dossier on the Cairo meeting with all the articles and web links, which is a great introduction to this reality of what's happening on the streets of Egypt. So please feel free to leave your name in the back. I think Barbara has a few closing words.
Thank you very much. Crossroads Cultural Center, like the meeting of Cairo and like the meeting of Rimini, is an entirely volunteer operation. And we thank our guests for coming here and speaking. You know, in Washington, in a venue like this, speakers of this caliber would get paid quite a lot of money. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't have expenses, like, for example, this room. We wanted to be here in the heart of downtown to be able to say these kinds of things. And so, if you like what you saw tonight, if you would like to support what we're doing, we certainly need whatever contributions people can give us in order to continue this kind of dialogue in the world. So if you'd like to leave a donation on your way out, there'll be someone you can do that right now. If you're not prepared tonight to do that, you can go to our website, and through a secured vehicle, you can make a contribution there as well. You can follow us now on Facebook too. So if you want to follow our events there, please leave your name if you would like to have our mailings for upcoming events, and we have a quarterly newsletter that goes out as well. Our next event will be in the beginning of June, one of the first or second Tuesdays in June, I think. It's called Van Gogh, Seduced by Beauty. The journey of Van Gogh's life and art, in his own words, through his letters to his brother Theo. That event is open to the public and free of charge as well, so please sign up for that, and thank you all for coming this evening.